On the second anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, Valery Legasov, deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute and head of the investigation commission, records a series of tapes exposing the truth behind the catastrophe. He places the blame on engineer Anatoly Dyatlov and other senior officials, believing Dyatlov's 10-year prison sentence was insufficient and that more powerful figures were truly responsible. Legasov feels Dyatlov's actions warranted death, yet that justice was never properly served. After hiding the tapes to protect them from the KGB, Legasov takes his own life at 1:24:45 a.m. 2 years and 1 minute earlier, at 1:23:45 a.m. on April 26, 1986, in Pripyat, Lyudmila Ignatenko steps out of her bathroom, sick and pregnant, just in time to witness reactor number 4 explode at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. A distant flash lights up the sky, followed seconds later by a far more powerful blast and a deep rumble that shakes the ground. Inside the control room, Anatoly Dyatlov refuses to accept that the reactor core has exploded. Ignoring clear evidence, he orders firefighters and plant workers to respond and demands that control rods be lowered and coolant restored, despite the futility of these actions. Firefighters, including Vasily Ignatenko, arrive at the scene and unknowingly walk among radioactive debris from the exposed core, immediately suffering radiation exposure and a metallic taste in the air. At 1:50 a.m., Dyatlov orders night shift supervisor Alexander Akimov to summon the day shift and continue pumping water into the reactor. He dismisses eyewitness reports that the reactor lid has been blown apart. When dosimeters read 3.6 Röntgen, Dyatlov ignores the fact that this is simply the maximum reading the devices can display. Higher range meters are locked away and inaccessible. By 2:30 a.m., plant director Viktor Brukhanov, chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, and Dyatlov conclude, incorrectly, that a hydrogen explosion caused a minor leak. At 5:20 a.m., the Pripyat Executive Committee decides to suppress the severity of the incident, blocking evacuation despite visible radiation burns and vomiting among workers. Communications are cut, the city is sealed, and blame avoidance becomes the priority as radioactive dust drifts toward Pripyat. As firefighting water floods the reactor buildings and pools beneath the core, Deputy Chief Operational Engineer Anatoly Sitnikov reports seeing nuclear graphite scattered on the ground, proof the core is exposed. His warnings are dismissed. He also records radiation levels of 200 Röntgen, the maximum his device can measure. As Dyatlov collapses from radiation sickness, Sitnikov is forced onto the roof to visually confirm the damage, where he receives a fatal dose almost instantly. Legasov is contacted by Boris Sherbina and told the situation is under control, though he is asked to provide technical advice at a government meeting the following day. Legasov warns that even a 3.6 Röntgen reading is extremely dangerous, but his concerns are brushed aside. Meanwhile, Akimov and his assistant Leonid Topchinov descend into the basement to manually operate coolant pumps. They succeed only briefly before succumbing to severe radiation exposure and being evacuated. Above them, radioactive smoke drifts into Pripyat as children walk to school, unaware of the danger. A bird suddenly drops from the sky behind them, twitching on the pavement as it dies. 7 hours after the explosion, around 8:30 a.m., nuclear physicist Ulana Khomiuk detects a sudden spike in radiation levels in Minsk. When local authorities dismiss her concerns, she concludes that Chernobyl must be the source and travels there herself. At Pripyat's overcrowded hospital, Lyudmila learns that Vasily and other patients suffering from acute radiation syndrome have already been evacuated to Moscow. In Moscow, Valery Legasov reviews a preliminary report from Chernobyl and notices a detail that alarms him. During a meeting arranged by Boris Sherbina, Legasov explains to Mikhail Gorbachev that the situation is far worse than reported. The report mentions smooth black debris, which Legasov identifies as graphite, material found only inside the core of an RBMK reactor. This confirms that the reactor core is exposed. He also points out that reported radiation levels of 3.6 Röntgens are misleading, as that is merely the maximum reading of low-range dosimeters. Legasov warns that the reactor contains kilograms of burning uranium-235, releasing particles that could contaminate the entire continent for centuries. Gorbachev immediately orders Legasov and Sherbina to travel to Chernobyl. During the helicopter flight, Sherbina asks Legasov to explain how a nuclear reactor works. As they approach the plant, Legasov spots graphite fragments and an eerie blue glow caused by ionizing radiation, confirming the exposed core. When Sherbina orders the pilot to fly directly over the reactor, Legasov urgently objects, warning that doing so would be fatal within days. At the site, Sherbina confronts plant officials who accuse Legasov of exaggeration. However, General Pikolov presents readings from a high-range dosimeter showing radiation levels of 15,000 Röntgens, proving Legasov was right. Legasov advises using sand and boron to suppress the fire, a dangerous operation requiring helicopters to fly close to the reactor. One helicopter crashes after striking a crane while passing through the radioactive smoke. As international radiation alarms trigger and satellite images reveal the disaster, Pripyat is finally evacuated on April 27, nearly 30 hours after the explosion. Legasov warns Sherbina that the radiation they are absorbing will likely kill them within 5 years. When Komiak arrives, she delivers an even more terrifying warning: if the molten reactor core reaches the water pooled in the flooded basement, it could trigger a massive steam explosion. She corrects Legasov's estimate, explaining they have only 2 days before the molten mixture reaches the water, potentially causing an explosion powerful enough to destroy the remaining reactors, contaminate vast regions of Eastern Europe, and render Ukraine uninhabitable for a century. Gorbachev authorizes a deadly mission to prevent this outcome. Plant workers Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov volunteer to drain the water. At 9:30 a.m. on April 28, 56 hours after the explosion, they enter the reactor building to open the sluice gates. As they descend into the dark basement, their Geiger counters roar and their flashlights begin to fail, forcing them onward into the radiation-filled darkness. The basement is successfully drained of radioactive water, and the 3 men who carried out the mission emerge alive and seemingly unharmed. However, a nuclear meltdown begins, threatening to contaminate local groundwater. The concrete pads beneath the reactors can hold for 6 to 8 weeks, but the fuel is so hot it will eventually burn through, releasing radiation into the rivers that supply water to over 50 million Soviet citizens. Shcherbina and Legasov convince Gorbachev that a heat exchanger must be installed beneath the plant, a task requiring all of the Soviet Union's liquid nitrogen. Minister of Coal Mikhail Shadov travels to Tula to recruit miners, led by Glukhov, to dig a tunnel in extremely difficult conditions. Initially distrustful, the miners agree, smearing Shadov's suit with coal dust as they board trucks to Chernobyl. Glukhov and his team of 100 men are instructed by Legasov to excavate a 150-meter cavern 12 meters below the reactor core to install the heat exchanger. Fully aware of the radiation, Glukhov agrees to proceed. The men work without protective gear or masks, knowing it would be ineffective, and in near-naked conditions due to the extreme heat underground, which reaches around 50 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, Shcherbina warns Legasov that they are under KGB surveillance. Legasov sends Komiak to a Moscow hospital, where she finds Dyatlov uncooperative, blaming others for the disaster. From dying Topchinov and Akimov, however, she learns that the reactor exploded after Akimov pressed the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button, a scenario previously thought impossible. Topchinov, in the final stages of radiation sickness, insists the explosion occurred immediately after the shutdown, and Akimov, also severely weakened, confirms the account. Lyudmila arrives in Moscow to find Vasily. She bribes her way into the hospital, lying about her pregnancy, and is allowed to see him. Ignoring instructions, she stays by his side, holding him close. His condition rapidly worsens. His skin darkens with blotches, and painkillers no longer ease the suffering as his nerve cells deteriorate. A plastic curtain is placed around his bed to contain radiation, but Lyudmila passes it to hold his hand, telling him he will soon be a father. She is reprimanded by the nurse, who insists other patients are in even worse condition, but Lyudmila defends herself, pointing out that no one else has visited her husband. During Komiak's visit, she notices Lyudmila holding her hand to her stomach and, realizing she is pregnant, threatens to report the breach. Komiak is arrested by the KGB but released after Legasov intervenes, emphasizing her value to the investigation. He instructs her to continue probing why the reactor exploded despite the emergency shutdown. Shcherbina and Legasov present their decontamination plan to the Central Executive Committee, outlining the massive mobilization of liquidators. They propose evacuating 600 square kilometers around Chernobyl, sanitizing 100 square kilometers near the plant, including shooting animals, cutting and burying forests, and removing topsoil, and constructing a containment structure to prevent further leaks. The plan requires 750,000 workers and will inevitably result in tens of thousands of casualties. In a field, Lyudmila stands among the relatives of other victims as Vasily and his fellow firefighters are sealed in lead coffins, lowered into a mass grave, and buried under concrete. Residents are evacuated from the wider Chernobyl exclusion zone, and decontamination efforts are underway. Civilian draftee Pavel is paired with Soviet-Afghan war veteran Bacho to patrol the zone and cull abandoned animals exposed to radiation. Inexperienced and unsettled, Pavel struggles when he discovers a dog and her puppies inside a house. During a break outside a school, Bacho encourages him to drink vodka and reassures him that feeling sick over killing the animals is natural. Their largely silent partner, Garo, reads a banner on the building that declares, "Our goal is the happiness of all mankind." By August 1986, 4 months after the explosion, Liquidator Commander General Nikolai Tarakanov deploys Lunokhod rovers to clear debris from the reactor roof so a containment shelter can be built. The roof has 3 levels, which Legasov has named Katya, the lowest, with 1,000 Roentgens, Nina, with 2,000 Roentgens, and Masha, the highest, at 12,000 Roentgens, where just 3 minutes of exposure is lethal. Clearing the roof is essential before the reactor core can be contained. In September, a West German robot sent to clear Masha fails almost immediately because it was not informed of the true radiation levels, which far exceed the official 2,000 Roentgens. By October, Tarakanov must rotate 3,828 liquidators in minimal protective gear to clear debris by hand, each allowed only 90 seconds. These biorobots use shovels to remove chunks of debris and toss them into the blown core. Khomyak investigates Moscow archives and confronts a recovering Dyatlov, who knows the government has no interest in the truth. She questions him about the positive void coefficient and the pressing of the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button, hinting that a similar accident had occurred 10 years earlier at a comparable RBMK reactor, but the findings were suppressed by the KGB. Though she has evidence in the table of contents, Dyatlov refuses to reveal more. Away from surveillance, Sherbina and Legasov tell Khomyak they must testify as experts in the upcoming trial of Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin, while Legasov will address the International Atomic Energy Agency. Khomyak shares a suppressed article about a 1975 accident at the Leningrad nuclear power plant and reports that Lyudmila's newborn daughter died from radiation poisoning. Legasov explains that when boron control rods were fully withdrawn during Chernobyl's emergency, the graphite tips of the rods actually enter the core first, briefly increasing reactivity, a fact unknown to the operators due to the suppression of the 1975 findings. Khomyak presses Legasov to reveal the full truth to the IAEA, while Sherbina urges caution to avoid political backlash. She emphasizes that 16 RBMK reactors in the Soviet Union share the same dangerous flaw and insists the Central Committee must be forced to take action publicly. On April 25, 1986, 12 hours before the disaster, Dyatlov met with Brukhanov and Fomin to discuss the final safety test needed to bring Reactor 4 fully online. Brukhanov had awaited this test for 3 years, as its completion would secure him a promotion to a prestigious post in Moscow. Dyatlov had reduced the reactor output to 1,600 megawatts in preparation, but Brukhanov, citing production quotas and orders from above, demanded that Dyatlov delay the further reduction for 10 hours. Dyatlov agreed, knowing that operating at reduced power for an extended period made the reactor unstable. Legasov's earlier testimony to the IAEA in Vienna had placed the blame solely on operator error, denying any design flaws in the reactor. Khomyak now urges him to tell the truth at Dyatlov's trial, exposing the RBMK reactor's inherent dangers and pushing the Central Committee to take action. In July 1987, Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin stood trial in Chernobyl. Sherbina testified first, explaining the operation of an RBMK reactor and the completion timeline of Reactor 4. He noted that Brukhanov had signed the reactor's completion certificate without performing a required backup generator test. Sherbina detailed the reactor's dependency on coolant water powered by the turbines and the critical role of backup diesel generators, which take 60 seconds to activate in case of a power drop. The safety test on April 26, 1986, was intended to verify that turbine power could maintain coolant flow for those crucial seconds. The day in question marked the fourth attempt. Previous trials had failed. Khomyak and Legasov recounted interviews with control room staff. By 2 p.m. on April 25, the reactor was at 50% output, set to be reduced further to 700 megawatts for the final test. At midnight, the shift changed, leaving Akhimov and Topchinov unaware of the test's purpose and untrained in the procedures. A 10-hour delay and Dyatlov's impatience led to a reactor stall and power spike. When Akhimov initiated the emergency shutdown with the AZ-5 button, a flaw in the control rods caused a sudden surge, resulting in the explosion. Legasov explained the technical factors: nuclear fuel increases reactivity, boron control rods reduce it, and steam formation creates a positive void coefficient. Under normal conditions, xenon buildup from fission is burned off, but at low power, it remained, reducing reactivity. When Dyatlov forced the reactor back to 200 megawatts and the test proceeded, the water pumps were turned off, leaving the reactor unmonitored. Legasov admitted he had previously lied in Vienna, revealing that the USSR had chosen graphite-moderated RBMK reactors with boron rods and no shielding because it was cheaper. When Akhimov pressed the AZ-5 button, the graphite-tipped rods initially increased reactivity, causing water to vaporize, rod channels to rupture, and the reactor to explode. The last recorded power level was 33,000 megawatts before the cap blew off, superheating the fuel and triggering the second explosion that destroyed the core. Legasov concluded that secrecy, cost-cutting, and skipped safety tests by Soviet authorities directly led to the disaster. Following the trial, Legasov was detained by the KGB. His testimony was suppressed, he was forbidden to speak publicly about Chernobyl, received no recognition for his role in managing the crisis, and was barred from working again. The epilogue shows the fates of those involved. Valery Legasov committed suicide on April 26, 1988.